Nearly everything about Cuba was a surprise, including the thought that I, or any other baby boomer of the Cold War era, would ever see it. And thanks to jumping at the chance to cover a religious trip with Episcopal bishops, I got to go. That was the biggest surprise of all. There's been a mystery about Cuba, a land hidden from America, frozen in time, full of stories of Havana nights and tropical days. And a story of people hidden from our view for nearly 60 years. People we're about to get to know if diplomacy continues the course that it's been on these past months. And if the U.S. joins the rest of the world in letting folks travel to Cuba without restriction. That's what most Cubans seem to want us to do.
I hope they feel the warmth of Cuban people, how we love Americans, and I would like them to see we're like Americans. I mean, we're a little bit different. We're Caribbeans, but we're so open to the world.
In this next half hour, we will get to know some of those Cuban folks who live so close to us, but yet are so far away. We will visit Havana, of course, but we will also see remote areas of the mysterious island, known for Castro, cigars, and old cars. Right now, only a few Americans can see these sites, and that's if they have an approved purpose, such as a religious trip. In other words, no week-long beach vacations yet. You have to have an approved reason to go. Otherwise, the Cold War still keeps the countries apart. The Cold War, old propaganda signs still are about the only billboards in Cuba. There is no doubt the socialist revolution changed life. Land went to the state, old mansions went to the state, and one profound change was in religion. The island was once declared to be atheist. The position was later softened, but many churches were left in ruins. It is perhaps both ironic and meaningful that humanitarian efforts, religion, and faith are leading the way in bringing the people of Cuba and the U.S. together. The Episcopal Diocese of Utah's Bishop Scott Hayashi and 10 other bishops of the Episcopal Church made a historic visit to Cuba and observed a changing country.
I think the most important thing that's given is a relationship that crosses boundaries of all sorts, and the learning that comes from that relationship of what life is like for each of us in our respective places.
2 years ago, they planned to just visit in support of Cuban Episcopal Bishop Griselda. But timing changed that. World-changing events, the week we were there, turned it into a time to start a conversation about uniting faiths once separated by the Cold War.
I think countries so close, they cannot continue having a barrier between them.
They found churches rising out of the ashes. Cuban citizen and our government tour guide, Manny Escalona, says that the youth are part of the rebirth.
Absolutely, I'm so surprised. You know, sometimes I call it the renaissance of religion in Cuba. Not one specific one, of all of them. And that's great.
Churches lost their property and bank accounts and have taken old houses or vacant buildings and made churches. What Manny called the renaissance of religion is not just what goes on in a house church. It is a feeling of sharing. It is humanitarian. It is life-giving. Approved religious tours can and do interact with the people, the very heart of the Cuba we have missed. Thus we saw parts of Cuba well outside of Havana, parts that have been unseen by much of the world. and certainly by Americans for half a century. It was seeing people share. In this little village of Atibo, a man said he could plant a garden in a vacant lot, and now it's a farm for the whole town.
It's like a paradise in the middle of the city.
And now they've added pigs, again, all to share. You see the people as being united in a way we could learn from them. A couple of churches now have these types of farms. It's new in Cuba, but no proceeds can go to the church.
Para que funcione correctamente, legalmente.
You know, the little farm they have a beautiful name for it. A bit of mustard. That's the name of that. Just a bit of mustard.
Okay.
And it was an amazing, legal struggle to have it.
Down the road in the village of Favorito, the people turned a once-collapsed house into a church. But more importantly, they are building a water system for the whole town of 3,000 people. Americans are helping. A small church in Jackson Hole is assisting this congregation.
I believe in Jackson Hole this ministry has been hugely important because it's very different. The context, the poverty in this part of the world is so different than the affluence in Jackson Hole. And it connects us with something we need to be connected with so we're not isolated as a very blessed people, but recognize there are blessings besides wealth, blessings of community, blessings of family, blessings of creation and building something together.
But the Cubans are not asking for tons of money. They were asking for replacement needles for a sewing machine. Coming up, more surprises, including going back to the Cold War, the Bay of Pigs, and all those Havana nights. And don't forget old cars, all still to come. As I have mentioned, Cuba was full of surprises, and one of the biggest came during the time that I was covering the visit of the Episcopal bishops. President Obama had just opened up a dialogue with Cuba, and everything changed. The caption reads, "One of the most important parts of President Castro's journey was the long-awaited handshake between Raul Castro and President Obama." Suddenly, there was a new importance to this visit. That country that was once officially atheist sent a leading communist to meet with the bishops. The head of religious affairs of the Central Committee of the Communist Party sat down and had dinner with Bishop Hayashi and the others over a home-cooked meal. It is a new time.
To meet with this official, however, the minister herself of this country, and to be sitting with her and chatting with her and talking with her over dinner and before dinner was really quite something.
It was like any home gathering you've ever seen, almost like a holiday meal with relatives and friends, informal and with the family cat on the floor. They asked if she had a message in her role as a top Communist Committee member.
So we waited to see what she would say, expecting, I believe, to hear a canned sort of response to that question. And she surprised us by simply saying that what we should report to the people here in the United States was our experience. That was all.
Not the party you may think of when you grew up in the Cold War. The people of Cuba are returning to churches. Still, only about 2% of the population attends, which is about what churches get in the state of Washington. But Bishop Hayashi and the others say it's left them inspired. Inspired is a good word for what you see in the people. We all thought there would be some anti-American sentiment. After all, you couldn't help but notice some signs around the country that certainly countered American capitalism. There is the display about the Cuban Missile Crisis in Havana, and at the Bay of Pigs, there are memories of the failed CIA invasion of 1961, and signs telling Cubans where Castro's command center stood, and where the CIA-trained mercenaries were stopped, and you can purchase Death to the Invaders signs.
I think part of me expected that the people who we met and the people in the restaurants and so forth wouldn't necessarily be happy to see people from the United States of America. coming to their country given the embargo and the difficulty the embargo has placed upon them. And yet, uniformly, we could not have been more warmly received and welcomed by the people themselves. Happy to see us. That was a very, very great surprise, and I'm very grateful for that.
Even the Bay of Pigs itself was a surprise. It is a tourist spot for picnics and perhaps is one of the most beautiful ocean views that you'll ever see. It is one of the most popular areas on the southern shore of Cuba, located not quite 100 miles southeast of Havana. The Bay of Pigs invasion was in 1961, just after the embargo. It was about our last sight of Cuba, and it left it locked in the 50s in our minds. And at the top of our 1950s memories was the sound of Havana nights. Well, everything you may have heard about Cuba and music in the 50s is true.
Cuba, Brazil, and the United States, the country with the largest amount of great musicians. And we have given to the world somewhat unique rhythm. Think about mambo and cha-cha-cha and salsa. So this is the lane of music.
You still see the remnants of that Cuban nightlife that made it all famous 60 years ago. Some are still open, some are just memories, such as the Lafayette in Havana. Oh, those Havana nights. How important was that music of the 50s? It can be answered this way. You'll find statues of war heroes all over Cuba. But in Cienfuegos, you will find an exception. It's a statue of Benny Moore, not a war hero, but perhaps the greatest Cuban singer of them all, and the Benny Moore Cafe, one of the few business signs you'll see in Cuba. And if you really want to find the 50s, yes, they're still here, on the southern shore of Cuba. You still see what can only be described as Miami Beach 1958, in some homes, unspoiled, and even a corner service station of the 50s, and hotels straight out of those times of dancing all night, with rooms that are also vintage 1950s. Oh, that! It's a swan that is left for the guest. Ah, thanks. Now, this hotel seems tame to the time when mafia boss Santo Trafficante Jr. built it. The pool is quiet by 10. Ah, the casino and nightclub would have just started by 10 o'clock 60 years ago. Coming up, old hotels and a walk through old Havana. Most hotels in Cuba are out of the past. We also stayed at the Presidente in Havana. It was built for President Coolidge, and well, looked that way. But again, the rooms were clean, just a little old. The view was great, however. You get a thought of just how big Havana is, a city of 2.5 million, just 104 miles from Florida, and yet we know so little about it. This is not a place to be afraid of, is it?
Not at all. This is a place to enjoy.
We don't realize the 1950s era that we last saw was almost 400 years into Havana's history. The old cathedral square has looked this way for centuries. The British brought Gothic churches. The French brought balconies to old homes and columns. It is the history of European architecture in the Caribbean, all once walled in as a fortress city protecting the harbor. And now, as Cuba looks to the future, Old Havana is being restored. The restoration includes the Capitol building, just as the Capitol building is being restored in Washington, D.C. In fact, it's pretty much a replica of the U.S. Capitol, with one difference.
It's going to be a great opportunity to take a look at the Capitol building, which is a couple of years, except ours is 7 inches higher.
Wait a minute, you said that the Capitol building looks like the one in Washington, D.C.
But ours is 7 inches higher, just to make a little bit of a difference between us. That's a perspective we have in history. We are the center of the world.
The old monastery is now a hotel. It is now surrounded by what is an old commercial building and surrounded by people. Oh, one hotel gets all the looks. It draws a crowd every day. It is where Ernest Hemingway lived in Old Havana. Old Havana is alive again as foreign investment comes in. Of course, not American investment yet. You are seeing cafes in the beginning of private commercial development.
I'm very proud of being Cuban.
Why is that at this time?
You know, this time it changes and people are keeping the best. That's why you're really proud of being in your country.
And they are seemingly keeping the best. It is a slow process. Now in all this, you haven't seen lots of neon or department store signs, or big businesses competing for your dollars. This is one of the few markets where farmers can actually sell directly to the people. There are no advertisements, just a billboard for Che Guevara. The prices are literally pennies for produce and other foodstuffs. You get what you see, the basics. It gets you thinking, maybe we do go a little overboard in our supermarkets with products.
I think being in Cuba reminds me that all of the things that we have in front of us that we take for granted and believe give us this great ability to choose whatever we want, that in and of itself may not necessarily be a good thing. That why is it the case we have to have that many different choices? Why do we need to have 30 different types of dental floss?
In addition to being able to shop in this market, virtually all Cubans get what is called a supply booklet. They get food for each member of the family based on a distribution system. The food is highly subsidized, meaning very few will go hungry, even though the average worker earns about $20 to $30 a month. Oh, but there is a marketplace for tourists. It's all in this giant warehouse building near the harbor. And what do people want? Well, apparently Che on everything. The man who despised capitalism and commercialism is on t-shirts, bags, and cigars. Oh, and I can't leave Old Havana without really noticing one thing I really like. They take care of the street dogs. Yeah, they even put tags on some of the dogs telling folks they are official street dogs and they belong to all Cubans. People are to feed them and care for them, and for that matter, dogs seem to have a good life in Old Havana, better than street dogs do in most countries. They live in museums and at churches and wherever they want to snooze in the hot weather. And it is hot and bright, and the days are long. And that brings me to another one of my favorite things about Cuba. In all the towns we went to, you will notice something. All of the places are painted in dozens of colors. Yeah, look, pastels and bright colors. There is a reason. Pure white would reflect too much heat and be too bright on the eyes.
We have 16 hours of natural light. If everything were white, it would be impossible to look around. So since the late Spanish times, I'm talking about like 1500s, there were certain regulations they call the West Indies Law. You know, you could not paint houses only in white. You have to combine with some other colors, resulting, so Cuba is like a rainbow.
Yes, a rainbow, interrupted by an occasional tropical storm, and an hour later, all is back to normal. And normal in Cuba is what makes Cuba different today. Normal is a combination of lots of the past and some of the future. For example, as you travel the island, you can see about any era along the roads. There could be a horse and buggy, or just a horse or two, a bicycle taxi, or a truck with lots of people in it. You see, if it's a state vehicle, it must pick up hitchhikers, all part of sharing, all part of getting people to work. And you might also see a new car, or an American car from years ago. In fact, from the first moment you get here, you see the old cars.
These cars were made with the steel of the Second World War, and they were built to last forever. Besides, you know, in Cuba, you have one card, it's a piece of jewelry of your family. So you have to keep it forever. It's a piece of jewelry. It's like your dog. And you know, it passes from one generation to another one.
Coming up, a wild ride. You know, you can talk about politics, you can talk about change, but you can't leave here without talking about cars. Such as this Chevy, I had to have my picture taken in front of it. Or this Buick Taxi. Sweet. Now you will note I shot video of a lot of these from the side or the back of the car. No, you don't want to get in front of them.
Cars got no brakes. Even if they tried, it's 70 years old. American cars were famous because they were sturdy and great, but I have to tell you something, they didn't have great brakes. Even if they tried to, it is impossible to stop.
But they certainly do move. Manny calls it the world's largest classic car museum.
You know, this is everyday cars. So we like when people come in and say classic cars. They say, no, these are the everyday cars.
Now an obvious question seems to be, how do you keep them going? Can you imagine keeping your daily driver going for 70 years? Or this Chevy, which has been at it in the heat of Cuba for decades, especially as there are no parts for these cars.
We make spare parts with our hands. Well, in some cases you can adapt Russian spare parts. Sometimes you have to make with your own hands, like pistons and, the chrome. We put the chrome right there.
Or you can use something else from something else.
So my sap got broken once. It was a problem with the piston. And I went to see a famous mechanic, and the man said, you know what? Look for a piston of a Russian motorcycle. I bought one, and it fixed perfectly.
Now this is what we know of Cuba, and ironically, it is also much of what they know about the United States.
Amazingly, this is Cuba, a country with no relationship with the States. But Cuban identity in the world is all American cars. American cars in Cuba.
Now the bad news is they wouldn't let me bring one of those old cars back to America. In fact, the best I could do was getting one of these, an old Cuban license plate. I would have preferred the car. So it seems like a good time to get into the old pink car and take a ride through Havana. Now it appears that there's no speed limit. Well, for that matter, any laws of the road. Oh, and you see the bus speeding along behind us? That contains the worried group of Episcopal bishops that I came down here with. Utah's Bishop Scott Hayashi is pressed against the windshield shooting pictures of me hanging out over the back of the car that may or may not have any brakes. Well, somehow we did stop. And kids, don't try this at home. Only on a hot afternoon in Cuba. Cuba is the place of surprises and the place of change. But it's also the place of history. And we end our visit the way Havana has ended the days for hundreds of years. Every night since the 1700s, except for during World War II, the town crier has walked along the fortress wall. And every night soldiers have followed. And every night they have climbed to the top of the fortress of the once walled city and fired a cannon. And the cannon fire signaled that the city was now closed. And Havana was safe for another night. Now, as another day approaches, Havana and the rest of Cuba will soon be open to America. In Havana, Cuba, Craig Wirth, good for Utah.